Right now, you are the only human species on the planet. That sentence sounds obvious, almost too obvious to say out loud, but for nearly all of human history, it wasn't true. As recently as 40,000 years ago, at least four other human species were walking the earth at the same time as us. Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, a tiny hobbit-sized species on a remote Indonesian island, possibly others we haven't even found yet. And then, one by one, all of them disappeared. Only one branch made it through. So what actually happened to the rest of them? Start with the most famous case, the Neanderthals. For a long time, the popular image was a dumb, hunched-over brute, losing out to smarter, more advanced humans. Modern research has almost completely dismantled that picture. Neanderthal brains were, on average, slightly larger than ours. They made tools, controlled fire, buried their dead, and used pigments that suggest symbolic thinking. In 2010, the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome revealed something that reshaped the entire field. Most people with European or Asian ancestry carry somewhere between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. They didn't simply vanish, they were absorbed. Interbreeding happened repeatedly over thousands of years in multiple regions, blending their lineage into ours before their distinct population disappeared. So if they weren't unintelligent and they weren't wiped out in some dramatic conflict, what actually happened? The leading explanation isn't a single catastrophe, it's a slow demographic squeeze. Genetic studies suggest Neanderthal populations were small and scattered, likely never numbering more than tens of thousands of individuals across the entire continent at any given time. Modern humans arriving from Africa came in larger, more interconnected groups with wider social networks and more efficient long-distance trade in tools and materials. When two closely related populations compete for the same resources, it doesn't always take violence for one to lose. It can simply take one side reproducing slightly faster, adapting slightly more efficiently, or surviving lean years slightly better, generation after generation, until the smaller population quietly stops existing as a distinct group. Climate made this worse. The period when Neanderthals disappear, roughly 40,000 years ago, overlaps with a series of extreme climate swings across Europe, rapid shifts between cold and even colder conditions that would have devastated the large game herds Neanderthals depended on. A population already stretched thin, competing with a growing rival species, hit by a series of brutal climate shocks, is a population running out of room to recover. Then there's Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the hobbit, after its discovery in 2003 on the Indonesian island of Flores. This species stood barely over 3 feet tall, with a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, and yet the evidence shows they made sophisticated stone tools and likely hunted small elephants called stegodons that once lived on the island. Isolated on Flores for hundreds of thousands of years, they evolved into a radically smaller form, a well-documented pattern called island dwarfism, seen in other isolated island species too. Their disappearance seems to line up disturbingly closely with the arrival of modern humans on the island, and separately with a massive volcanic eruption in the region, though researchers are still debating exactly which factor mattered most or whether it was both at once. The Denisovans are the strangest case of all, because for over a decade, nobody had a face to put to the name. The entire species was identified in 2010 from a single finger bone and a few teeth found in a Siberian cave, using DNA analysis alone. We still don't have a complete Denisovan skull, and yet we know they interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans because their DNA shows up today in some Melanesian and indigenous Australian populations at levels as high as 4 to 6%. There's even evidence of a hybrid individual nicknamed Denny, whose DNA revealed a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. Direct proof that these different human species weren't living in isolation from each other at all. They were interbreeding repeatedly across the whole continent. This pattern shows up again and again once you start looking. Homo erectus, the longest surviving human species in history, persisted for close to 2 million years before finally disappearing sometime around 100,000 years ago, possibly later on the island of Java. Homo naledi, discovered in a South African cave system in 2013, had a brain about a third the size of ours. Yet the site contains evidence some researchers argue points to deliberate burial of the dead, a behavior once assumed to be uniquely modern. So why are we the ones still standing? Not because we were dramatically smarter, not in any simple sense. It's more likely a combination of small advantages stacked on top of each other. Larger, more connected social networks that spread innovation faster, a broader and more flexible diet that survived climate swings better, and possibly just favorable timing, arriving at the right regions during the right climate windows while other populations were already stressed. Every one of those advantages sounds modest in isolation. Compounded over tens of thousands of years, they were enough to tip the balance permanently. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Being the last human species standing wasn't inevitable. It wasn't written into our biology as some kind of destiny. It was closer to a coin that kept landing the same way, again and again, until the other options quietly ran out. If a handful of climate patterns, migrations, or chance encounters had gone slightly differently, you might not exist in your current form at all, or you might be sharing this planet right now with 2 or 3 other species that call themselves human, each with their own history, their own tools, their own dead they chose to bury. So the next time you think of human as a single, obvious category, remember that for most of our history, it wasn't. It was a small, crowded family tree with several branches all walking the earth at once, and you are simply the branch that happened to still be growing when all the others quietly stopped.